So in the first video of our Xactimate series, I just want to go over general areas of each Xactimate estimate, what you can look for, what you need to keep an eye out for to make sure that you maximize those files and get the most money that you can for each job. Here in this first example, it's a fairly basic example, but it will give you the general overview of the three main areas that are going to be in every Xactimate estimate that you come across. One is going to be the introduction, where a lot of just basic homeowner information, address, claim information, all of that's going to be captured. The second area is what I'm going to call the line item portion. That's where it actually gets into the meat and potatoes of what the carrier has approved on that estimate, what you can expect to see them paying you for that job. The final piece is the summary. That's where it takes all the line item estimate totals, puts it into that one big number that everybody likes to see because that's what that job is worth, that's what you're going to get paid at the end. So for this example here on this first page, you can see that, like we said, it's got areas for homeowner information. It also has areas for claim rep information. It's got business information for that specific insurance company. What you're also going to have is a claim number, policy number, and what that loss was reported as. This can be very important as you're trying to supplement files, because if it's filed as only a wind claim and you're trying to justify hail damage on that loss, that's going to be very difficult if it was called in as just a wind claim. So when you're working with your homeowners, make sure that they're calling the claim in for the appropriate damage to make sure that everything can be included. You're also going to have, clean this up a little bit. At the very bottom of this page, you're also going to have dates. These dates can tell you a lot in terms of how quickly you need to get those repairs done. A lot of policies have statutes that limit how long you have to complete the repairs to make sure that that policy is still an RCV policy. So focus on the date of the loss right here, and then the date of the inspection right here. Those two dates can be very important as you go through the process. Two other things that you'll see on this page that I want to bring mention to. One is the price list right here. The price list is something that you'll need to keep an eye out for, because that's what's going to determine the price of the materials for the estimate. A lot of carriers will default to a price list for when the actual loss occurred, not when the repairs are completed. We all know that there can be a big difference between when the loss happened and the price of the materials when you're actually going to do the job. So keep an eye out for the price list, because that can make a big difference. The other thing on this page is this section right here. Everything that we do, any contract that we sign, has fine print. This can be considered some of the fine print of this estimate. This goes into which was a third-party adjusting company. This just tells you what their feelings are, what they're allowed to do, what they're authorized to do. Make sure we're reading these very closely. This can give you more information about how you're going to have to approach this file as you go through. As we move down the page, we get into that second portion that I referenced, which is the line item section. On here, as you'll see, each section will have a heading. This one is the roof heading. Within each section, you will then have the actual line items that have been approved on that estimate. When you look at the individual line items, we then have quantities in this column here. We have unit prices per the system here, taxes, and then the total amount once we calculate the quantity by the price and add the tax into it. This number here at the bottom, this $35,000 number on this specific estimate, this is what they're saying the total roof cost is as it's been approved right now. This is something to keep an eye out for if you're only doing portions of the job, and we'll get into that in another video, but this may be the number you need to focus on instead of the number I'll talk about later on the summary page. As we continue to move down the estimate, we simply have more line item sections. Again, they all have a specific heading, as you can see, roof, gutters, and then some interior. They all have the same features with a quantity, a unit price, tax, the RCV, and then they do talk about depreciation and ACV. We'll get into those in a later video when we talk about the difference of RCV and ACV. As we can continue to go down, you see more line items, you see more summary totals. This is one place where if you are doing all the work on the estimate, you can come down to the line item totals, you can see this RCV amount here. That is the total amount of the job that you will see on the summary pages as we continue to move down. So moving on down, we come to that summary that I was talking about. On this page, it takes the whole estimate and combines it into one easy to read form. So you'll see this first line for the line item total. If you come across, this is a pre-tax total. This $37,000 is pre-tax. The next line below that is where they add the tax into it. So you'll see this estimate has $1,000 in tax. On down, that big number that we referenced that was on the page up above. If you're doing everything on the estimate, that's the total that you're going to look at. They then have depreciation broken out. This is a page where you'll be able to determine if it's a replacement cost policy or an actual cash value policy, depending on how the depreciation is labeled. Again, we'll get into that more in a future video when we're talking about the difference between RCV and ACV policies. As we continue to go down, this page references your deductible. It references the depreciation again. And then you can see here, this bottom line, if depreciation is recovered, it tells you what the total payout to the homeowner will be. When we talk about invoicing, we'll go over this, but as you see, there's a difference between this line item and this line. That difference is the deductible. Keep that in mind as you're going through estimates whenever you're working on invoicing. Again, we'll talk about that in a future video. Here in this second example of an Xactimate estimate that we see at Balance, you'll see that it starts off with the fine print. This gives you just some details about what this specific insurance company requires whenever you file a loss. This is more for the homeowner, but we want to make sure that the homeowner understands this too. This is some of the requirements that they have to follow to make sure that that loss is fully covered, because it talks about their policy. We can't interpret policy. We recommend that you guys be careful trying to interpret it. If there are questions, get in touch with their agent. Make sure that they fully understand what they have to do and what some of these words mean on this page. Some of the things that you will find, though, do talk about what you have to do in order to have a supplemental estimate reviewed. It can talk about timeframes to make sure that that estimate stays as a replacement cost policy or estimate instead of an actual cash value estimate. This specific carrier does provide a summary page of how to read their estimates. However, as you can see, there's a lot of information on here. You have to try and tie a number here or here or here to the corresponding number over here on this page, and then try and understand what this means tied to this number. For a homeowner that doesn't completely understand an insurance policy, that can be very, very difficult for them to understand and can be overwhelming. We encourage you to work with your homeowners, help them understand what this really means, help them understand what they have to do, and really get them on your side from the get-go before you get too far into the process. As we continue to go down this estimate, we come into the information and the summary sections in one. This carrier provides it all at the beginning before the line item portion. So you can see here at the top, again, we have the insured and property information. We have the estimate and claim number and policy number here. We have phone numbers, we have deductibles, we have dates of loss. Again, this is an important date when it comes to getting the repairs completed to make sure that that depreciation is released. Over here, we come back to the price list. Now, one thing you might notice here, if you were looking close enough at the last estimate, the price list on the last one had 4 letters, but then said 8X, and then had the date. We'll talk about this a little bit more as we get into invoicing, into some of the differences between RCV and ACV, into some of the nitty-gritty of the estimates, but this is something that can impact what you're paid out on that file. Xactimate does allow you to search for any price list by name. It doesn't have to just be by zip code and date. So keep that in mind. You can search for the specific price list on the carrier's estimate if that's something you need for that file. As we go down this, we actually get into the summary section. So here, it's the same items that we saw at the bottom of the last estimate. This is just at the top. So we still have the line item total. We still have the tax. And then we have the big number here that is the total approved amount of money for the dwelling coverage on this estimate. This breaks down the depreciation more, but the numbers that you need to focus on are still the ones up here. The big number is the number that's approved for that file at this point. As we leave this summary page, we get into more fine print from this carrier. This carrier does again provide homeowner information at the top of the page. It provides the date of loss on multiple pages, so there are multiple areas where you can see some of the same information. But then on this page, this is where a lot of their fine print is. The most important portion of this page is right here. I was talking about paying attention to the date of loss and what some of the fine print is that will help determine whether that policy is ACV or RCV. This section specifically right here tells you the amount of time that you have to get the repairs done from the date of loss. That is something else that you need to pay attention to, whether that's from the date of the loss or the date of the inspection. There are some times where the loss is filed and the inspection doesn't occur for 6 months. That has already taken 6 months off that time frame. So definitely pay attention to how long you have and what that date is from as you're going through signing these jobs up. This then gets into more information about the loss, about payments on the policy. So a lot of this stuff, again, is for the homeowner. If you're knowledgeable enough about it and can help them understand it, obviously that's going to build credibility with you and just strengthen that relationship with you and your homeowner. As we come down into this estimate, one thing you'll see here is this random box up top. If measurements are included on an estimate, you will typically see a sketch here, and then you will see measurements here. One thing about this is these are not actual measurements. This is just a placeholder for the carrier to then be able to put line items into this section instead of just a general folder in the estimate. So these measurements don't actually correlate to the measurements that you're seeing down here. For this estimate, you'll see, very similar to the last one. We have the line items. We have quantities here. We have unit prices next to it. We have taxes. We have the full RCV of that given line item. One difference here is they actually will break out the depreciation by how many years they're depreciating that item, what the depreciation is, and then they give you the ACV. Again, we'll get more into that in another video when we're talking about the difference between RCV and ACV. One thing to keep an eye out for on some estimates is whether or not there's actually a line item cost. This line item for drip edge is an approved line item. However, you'll see here, there's no cost tied to it at the end of the line. That doesn't mean it's not approved. That just means that this carrier is not including the dollar value for that line item until it is actually repaired or replaced. So if you're trying to create an invoice before you actually get an item here, you need to pay attention to what is in the note. This note will tell you what cost they're allowing for that line item without it actually being listed in the estimate. We'll get more into that again as we go into invoicing and the difference between ACV and RCV. So as you continue to move down, you'll see it's very similar to the last estimate. The line items continue. They tell you what all the items are that have been approved to this point. Then we go into another section that is just for a copper seamed roof on this specific job. We continue down through anything that's been added to this point on this estimate. You'll see the similarities again at the bottom of each section. It does include the summary costs. So you'll see here for the front elevation, they've already approved $1,000 roughly for the repairs on that elevation. If that's something that you can do those repairs for, great, you're good. This will help you determine whether or not you need to supplement for those repairs though. We come down and we continue to see we've got elevations. There are no measurements there, so that means there's not actually a sketch or drawing in the estimate for this. It would show up to the left of the measurements, and then you would have those measurements actually listed out if they were in the estimate. So as we continue to go down, kind of skip through these line item sections, we come to a summary page. There can be many different summary pages within an estimate. This one just happens to focus on overhead and profit and tax. So if you see right here, it tells you that there's no overhead and profit that's been applied to this estimate. 0 and 0%, $0 here. As you move down, you can see that the adjuster has applied 7% tax to this estimate. This can be very important because adjusters aren't always going to confirm what the sales tax is in your market. So if they have 7% and say your tax is actually 8 or 9%, this value for tax could impact what you can invoice at the end of that job. So make sure you're paying attention to the summary pages that show you what the tax is in case that's something that you need to supplement for. As we continue to go down, we come to the fabulous sketch on this estimate. As I said, this one is one that the carrier just threw a box in as a placeholder to be able to add line items to. That's not the actual depiction of the roof. Here's the third example that I want to show you of an Xactimate estimate. It can be very confusing with all the different formats that the carriers produce the estimates in as to where to find the information. So if you do have any questions outside of this video, please don't hesitate to put a question in the chat and we'll make sure and get an answer to you as quick as we can. So with this example, very similar to the other two, it starts with your information page. It's got the insured name and property. It's got contact information for the homeowner, claim information here, and then it has claim number information, policy information, type of loss. Again, the type of loss can be very important as to whether or not you'll be able to supplement for additional damages. Make sure we're paying attention to the type of loss whenever we're getting these files submitted. Here's also the cause of loss here. As we scroll down, one difference that you'll see here is that they provide a summary of the coverages, and then they will also tell you what the deductible is here. Again, something that we'll talk about when we look at the invoicing portion of this, but the deductibles are important because that will not be reflected in the estimate as a payment to the homeowner, but that is a cost that you should be receiving from the homeowner when you complete the repairs. As with the others, we have dates. Pay attention to the date of loss. As we discussed, that can be very important when determining whether it's an ACV or an RCV policy. And then the price list. So with all three examples, they all have the same information in these introductory pages, but it's just in different spots. So make sure you're looking for the triggers like price list, like date of loss, type of loss. If we're looking for those triggers, we'll be able to have a lot of information about what we need to do as we're continuing through this project. This is another example of having the summary of the estimate before the line item portion. So again here, it has the same information, line item total, material tax, subtotal. This job does have overhead and profit on it. So you can see over here that these are both for overhead and profit. And then we have the total replacement cost, same as the other estimates, the big number here that you want to look for if you're doing all the repairs on the job. This estimate has multiple summaries, so you'll see all of the same information just for code coverage and other structures. Again, the information for the homeowner, dates, and then the summary page. You'll see here at first, it shows $0 for the replacement cost value of the code coverage. That's because they do not account for that until it has actually been incurred with the repairs. At that point is when you'll see paid when incurred, and then you can look for the big number that you'll be able to add to your invoice. If you are doing the dwelling coverage and the code coverage, you'll have to add those together for your invoice. We'll go into more detail on that whenever we talk about invoicing the job. At the bottom of these first two summary pages, what you'll also see is some fine print. This fine print can be very important. This is what talks about whether you're able to supplement the file or not. So if you believe a supplement's needed, before they'll consider it, you have to give them a chance to re-inspect to see if those damages are relevant with this file. So what this is saying is that for this specific carrier, if you don't give them the opportunity to review the supplement, they may be able to deny that because they didn't have a chance to see if it was part of the policy that could be extended on that. If you're not sure what these mean, we don't interpret the policies. We would always encourage you to get with the homeowner, get with their agent, make sure you truly understand what their policy allows before getting too far into that job. As we continue to go, you'll see one more summary page that I discussed. This is for the other structures. We'll talk about it more in the invoicing section, but if you're doing the entire estimate, you will have to add all three sections together to get the total value for your invoice. As we move on down, here's another one of those summaries that we talked about. One thing you'll see on this one, like we talked before, it tells you what they've applied for overhead and profit. Sometimes you'll see these are different values. If you're okay with the values, great, move on without it. That is something that you can supplement for. It can be a challenge to supplement, but we always encourage you, figure out what your true overhead is also. The industry has said it's 10 and 10, but if your overhead is more than 10, that's something that we encourage you to, with documentation, provide to the carrier and see if that's something you can get taken care of. Again, with the tax, Pay close attention to the sales tax that they're approving on that estimate. You could be losing a significant amount of money if you don't supplement for the proper sales tax. As we move down, we get into the line item portion that we've talked about, that every estimate has. We talked about a sketch on the last estimate that wasn't actually a sketch. On this estimate, you'll see that it is. This roof sketch is most likely an eagle view that's been dropped in here by the carrier. This sketch will also be at the end of the estimate, but you can see here, there's a summary of the measurements that they're going off of for this estimate. So these measurements should correlate with the line item quantities, assuming they've approved the full roof on this file. As you go down, the biggest difference with this estimate that you have to be aware of is that in these line item totals, it does not account for tax. So if you're only doing specific portions of the estimate, that's something you'll need to be aware of when invoicing, and that's something that we'll give you some tips and tricks on when we get into that invoicing video. But as you go down, it's very similar. They've got the line items, they've got the quantities, the unit price, the RCV. With this estimate, you can actually see the quantities that the carrier is referencing for that item and where they got them. So if you don't feel like the quantity is accurate, you'll actually be able to go back and explain to them which one of these numbers they should be including and why. One other unique thing about this estimate, we talked about the PWARR line item in the last estimate. This carrier just does a little bit different. This line item for ice and water shield is approved. We get a lot of questions of, well, why did you include that? It's struck through. That means it's not approved. No, this simply means it's a paid when incurred line item. So this is something that that is approved by the carrier. You don't have to supplement for it, and it's included in that summary page up at the top for building code coverage. Keep that in mind as you're going through. This is an approved item. It's just struck through because they're not paying for it until you've actually done those repairs. As we continue on down, it's more line item sections, we've got elevations, we've got more quantities that we've discussed. Because sketches are in the estimate for these. We've got all the line items that they have initially improved. Make sure that you're paying close attention, especially on elevations. There are a lot of small component line items that you still can add to the estimate when supplementing, so make sure you're looking at that very closely. Go ahead and come through to the bottom of this estimate because these sections are very similar to the previous two examples. You'll see here there is a summary section that includes measurements throughout the estimate. So these measurements, the grand totals area, these measurements have already been accounted for somewhere else in the estimate. They're just super colliding everything into one measurement summary at the end of the estimate. They also give you a summary section here for the values. So you'll see the dwelling, code coverage, and other structures. What you need to pay attention to here is that this is 0. Because that line item is struck through in the actual estimate, it will not show here. It only shows up in the top summary page. So if you're invoicing for this job, and we'll go into more detail again, this is not the number you want to use if you're doing the full estimate. This estimate then does have a couple other recap sections. We don't tend to use these a lot. They recap them by room, by trade. They can be valuable to you depending on how your business functions from a finance perspective, how you need to code certain things if you're using QuickBooks, for example. So these sections are going to be more dependent on your actual business and how it functions, but they do break all the estimate down into, like I said, specific trades, specific rooms, so on and so forth. At the end of this estimate is more of the fine print. This estimate has it scattered throughout the whole thing. Frequently asked questions, again, like with the others, it's more information for the homeowner, but make sure if they have questions that you're doing whatever you can to help strengthen that relationship. If you don't know the answer, point them in the right direction, whether it be an agent, someone else in the industry, to make sure that they have any questions answered before you get too far down the process. One final example that I want to go over with you today is a Symbility example. Symbility is the second most common estimate that we see at Balance in terms of estimating software, and it is very different from Xactimate. The line items, it has a line item section. As you can see here, it doesn't actually start with an introduction or summary section. One thing you also will not see on these estimates is a price list. You cannot always confirm what they use. Symbility is updated monthly as well, but you're not going to be able to tell just by looking at the estimate what month has been used. It has some of the same sections as Xactimate in terms of it has a quantity section, a unit price, the RCV, depreciation, and ACV. Similar to the last Xactimate example that I showed you, this does not break the tax down into the line items. So that can be a problem whenever you're invoicing. As you'll see here, we get into the line item sections. They break it down similar to Xactimate. It gives you the description of what the line item is. One thing with Symbility that Xactimate does not do is it shows you what they're accounting for with waste in this specific line item. Xactimate's is hidden into the back components section. Symbility actually tells you what waste they're allowing. So there's only 229.78 linear feet, but the system is actually allowing for 252 with waste. Something unique about Symbility that is a little bit more information than what Xactimate gives you. One thing that most carriers do with Symbility is they'll break it down. Shingles, underlayment, vents. So they give you a heading within each section in terms of what's in that section. As we go through, again, additional line items, the same information that we talked about above, references waste, you have the unit cost and the quantities. We always recommend, if you're writing an Xactimate, comparing it to a Symbility estimate, try and find the closest line item that you can. There are going to be some things in Symbility that don't exist in Xactimate and vice versa. You just have to find the line item that is the closest comparable item to add to your estimate. As we come through to the bottom of this section, you'll see that they also have the summaries here. It's a little close together, but that's your RCV pre-tax. Keep in mind, like we discussed, there's no tax broken out into the line item, so this is a pre-tax total. As you come down, we come to the summary section for Symbility. You'll see here that they actually break it down into materials and labor. So you'll be able to see what Symbility is paying for materials and labor separate to compare that to your own costs. They then have some equipment that they factor in depending on what trades are included. This is where you see the tax. So like we said with Xactimate, make sure that that tax that's applied is appropriate. If not, that's something we recommend that you supplement for. You'll also see here they break down overhead and profit. Tells you what the percentages are. Again, if you feel like that's incorrect, we encourage you to supplement for that as you see fit. And then the replacement cost value here, the big item or big number that if you're doing everything on that estimate, that's what you want to look for. As we continue down this page, that's when they will get into depreciation, deductibles. We'll get into that more again as we talk about how to actually invoice for the jobs based on these estimates. They do have some fine print on some of these estimates as well. And then as you keep going down, kind of a duplicate summary page, more fine print. And then this is where they actually get into the intro at the end of the estimate. So this is where you'll see the claim number, policy number. You'll see the date of loss that we talked about that can be so important. And then they have a letter to their homeowner. On this page, they also have a more simplified breakdown that tells you what the total cost is, tells you the deductible, tells you the depreciation. Make sure you're looking very closely at all this information. Again, help the homeowner understand what all of this means. They'll be more comfortable with you, more comfortable in your ability to understand what's going on, which just make things a lot easier as we go down. And then this is just the end of their letter that summarizes kind of what the homeowner can expect. So I hope this first video has been helpful for you guys to understand some of the basics, some of the components of Xactimate, of Symbility, how they can be different but include the same information. The next video will dig a little bit deeper into what's included in those line items, the difference between ACV and RCV, some of the PWI, PWARR, what that really does mean, some more detail behind it. And then we'll follow that up with another video about invoicing to hopefully get you guys more prepared and more equipped to get as much money as you can and to make sure that you're limiting your exposure to potential insurance fraud by invoicing for things you didn't do. Thanks again. If you have any comments, please feel free to leave them in the chat, and we'll get back with you as soon as we can.